Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Delighted to have you for our third program in a series of 5 programs this academic year dealing with the questions of justice, justice for all. My name is Tom Morgan. I am the director of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice here at St. Scholastica. And again, thank you all for coming. These lectures are sponsored by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice and funded in part by the Warner Lecture Series of the Manitou Fund, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Everen Foundation, and the Mary C. Van Everen Foundation Endowed Fund in memory of William Van Everen, a former trustee of the college. Additional support has been received from the Royal D. Alworth Jr. Institute at the University of Minnesota Duluth and the UMD Department of World Languages and Cultures, Reader Weekly of Duluth, and from numerous other private donors. Thank you all very much for your continued support, moral support and financial support. They're both appreciated. Those of you who aren't on our mailing list or our sign-up sheets or anything, or our email lists, there are paper and pencil out in the lobby for you to fill out. If you want to receive more information about upcoming programs, put your email address nice and clear so we can read it, or your street address, or both. If you put your street address, you'll get postcards in the mail from us. Also out in the lobby, there is at least one table with information available from the UMD Department of Criminology and Restorative Justice, and you're welcome to look at that, of course, after the lecture. Next week on Monday, as we so often do, we are all invited to gather again to talk about what we're about to hear tonight and to try to analyze it and make some sense out of it and maybe think about where to go from here. You all should have had flyers like this in your hand. That's information about where the next Talks Back session will be. First Lutheran Church, Monday, 7 p.m., and the 2 facilitators, Don Strufert and Ted Lewis. And their biographies and credentials are on that sheet, so I invite you to look at that. After the formal presentation tonight, then we'll invite you to ask questions of our speaker. Make your questions crisp and to the point. One speech a night is enough, but I mean, we invite you to ask questions, and if you have questions and want to talk about a particular issue that the speaker raises, then you just come to one of these microphones and you'll be recognized in turn. If students come forward and you community people do the right thing and defer to the students, let them go first, because they pay a lot for this. They deserve to go first. But I think there'll be time for questions for everybody. On the screens to my right and to my left, we're displaying the text of tonight's lectures through technology called real-time captioning. Although we anticipate a high-quality format, there will inevitably be errors that are inherent to the technology. Special thank you to the Edwin H. Eddy Foundation, whose generous support makes this inclusive service possible. Speaking of technology, if you've got any in your pocket or your purse, now would be a good time to turn it off so you can give all your attention to the speaker. Our speaker this evening is a professor of law and the director of the Criminal, Juvenile Justice, and Racial Justice Clinical Programs at the University of San Francisco School of Law. Lara Bazelon is a graduate of the New York University School of Law. From 2012 to 2015, she was a visiting associate clinical professor at Loyola Law School and the director of the Loyola Law School Project for the Innocent. Currently, she's a member of the board of the Project for the Innocent, Professor Bazelon was a trial attorney in the Office of the Federal Public Defender in Los Angeles for 7 years, and prior to that, she was a law clerk on the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Professor Bazelon's scholarship focuses on the intersection of ethics and criminal justice advocacy. She is the co-chair of the American Bar Association's Ethics, Gideon, and Professionalism Committee, and serves on the association's Criminal Justice Council, Criminal Justice Section, Women's Task Force, and is a reporter for the association's Ethics and Forensics Task Force. Professor Bazelon is a contributing writer for Slate and Political Magazine, where her long-form journalism and opinion pieces appear regularly, including a long-run series in Slate on issues ranging from wrongful convictions. Her essays and op-eds have also been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic, San Francisco Chronicle, and Los Angeles Times. Professor Bazelon's book, Rectify, it's up there on the screen, The Power of Restorative Justice After Wrongful Conviction, was published in October of 2018. It'll be on sale after the lecture. And if you play your cards right, you'll get her to autograph the book if you want to buy one. She is a recipient of a Writer in Residency Award from the MacDowell Colony in 2016 and from the Mesa Refuge in 2017, where she was named the Jacob and Valeria Langluth Fellow for Excellence in Writing about issues relating to the criminal justice system. In her spare time, Professor Bazelon enjoys joyful dinners and time alone to write. And she looks after and tries to keep up with her 2 children, Carter, age 10, and Ella, 8. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Lara Bazelon.
Thank you everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan, for that introduction, and thank you to the Alworths and to President McDonald for this lovely welcome. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you. And I know that Dr. Morgan had mentioned that one speech is long enough, and I'm going to make this as much as I can not a speech and more of a conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to really talking to all of you in the question and answer part. So before we get there, I wanted to start with sort of the premise behind this book, which is basic questions of why do wrongful convictions happen? Who are the survivors of wrongful conviction? And what does life look like for them afterward? So this started for me in this really personal way because that was me. I was the attorney in this case called In Re Cash Register. Cash was my client. Actually, that's his given name. His mom named him Cash, and his last name is Register. And he was convicted in 1979 of killing an elderly white man in a robbery. He was innocent, however, his lawyer really didn't marshal the evidence to show that, and more importantly, the 2 eyewitnesses against him were not, in fact, eyewitnesses at all. They lied for their own reasons, and the prosecution pretty much knew that, but were more interested in putting him away than in finding the truth. And so as a result, he was incarcerated from 1979 until this day when this picture was taken, which was November the 7th, 2013, and that was the day after a very long retrial that the judge overturned his conviction. And so in litigating this case, I brought to it my public defender mentality, which had always served me really well in an adversarial context because I was trained to be a trial lawyer, and I am a good trial lawyer, and that's because I adopted an adversarial mindset, and that was the mindset that allowed me to cross-examine all of the witnesses that the prosecution brought to try to show that this case somehow had some kind of legitimacy when it really didn't, and to just face down repeated efforts to fight us in our efforts to free our client. And it was very, I think, disappointing and also to me somewhat embittering dealing with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, and I'll be honest with you. We came to them a month before the trial and we laid out all of the evidence that we had found, including evidence that strongly suggested from their own files that they had held back exculpatory information, that they had essentially bribed some witnesses to say things that weren't true, that there was all of this other extenuating information that very clearly showed that he did not do it, and rather than concede error and just dismiss the case, which is what we hoped that they would do, they forced it all the way through to the retrial. And one of the things that really stuck out to me about this retrial was that the victim's family came to the retrial. And the prosecution, of course, had told them that it was this terrible injustice and it was so awful that they were going to have to go through this again, and the whole thing was sort of a sham, and don't worry, he'll just be convicted all over again. And for the family sitting there every day watching the prosecution's case unravel and seeing really that it was built on a house of cards and just sort of a castle really of lies was very upsetting, even from the point of view of being my client's lawyer. And for the first time in my legal career, I started really thinking about the victims and who are the victims. And of course, my client was a victim of what happened, and at the time that this happened, he was with someone, she was having a baby, so when she had the baby, he was in jail. He never saw his daughter outside of jail. They were separated basically for 34 years. He ended up not staying with her mother, which is very typical in these circumstances when you believe that the person is never going to get out, which was the verdict and the sentence. His mother had to spend 34 years without him, and just the suffering that this family went through. When his brother died, for example, or his father died, he couldn't go to the funeral. And I was very focused really on my client's suffering and what he'd been through because it was very motivating for me in terms of my representation, and also because he testified at the trial, and it was important to bring all of this out and show the judge not only was he innocent, but also this is someone who was a decent person and was a good person and was someone who really would do well in the outside world. But I really started to think during this trial about the victim's family and how they were also victims in what had happened, and that they had been victimized by the system, which had promised them this outcome of delivering this verdict and delivering justice to them, and instead had served up an innocent person and incarcerated them and told this family all of these lies. And it seemed to me that there was this huge problem that this case had exposed, which is that we have a very binary way of looking at the criminal justice system, which is we think about it as right and wrong, us versus them. We think about somebody winning and somebody losing. We think about it in black versus white, and often that's literal, which I'll get to the racial implications of all of this in a minute. And we really think about it as good versus evil. And as I said, it's so much more complicated than that. And also, there are victims and perpetrators often on both sides. And another thing that we don't think about is kind of the circle of victims. And this was also brought home to me in this case because when Cash was exonerated in 2013, he had done the most time at that point of any exoneree in the history of the United States. Now, sadly, that record has been broken by other exonerees, but at the time, 34 years was the longest. And because of that, and because of his name, and because of some of the more extraordinary circumstances of the case, it got a lot of media attention. And as a result of that, one of the jurors read about it. And he wrote me an email. And in the email, he said that he was absolutely horrified to learn the truth of this case and that he had participated in the conviction of an innocent person, which is something that he was going to have to carry with him for the rest of his life. And I've talked a bit about how I think that there were bad actors in this case. I think the police and the prosecutors in Cash's case were truly bad actors, not just in his case, but in other cases. But oftentimes there are mistakes. There are legitimate good faith mistakes by law enforcement, and then they too have guilt to carry around. And so you can see how the circle of victims is concentric and it keeps kind of rippling outward. So I started thinking about, well, how many other victims and how many other exonerees are there? And we know, because there's this organization called the National Registry of Exonerations, that there are several thousand, and that's just the exonerees, so then you can multiply outward and talk about all of the people who've been impacted in the way that I've discussed. And I started focusing on this one case in Virginia because I thought it was pretty extraordinary and yet also typical, so I'm going to talk to you a bit about that. The victim in this case, Janet Burke, you're looking at a picture of her. She was 18 years old, living in Richmond, Virginia, and working at a daycare center, taking care of kids. It was in a church. And she was opening up the center one morning, and a man broke in, a black man, and he violently raped her. And she did what victims are supposed to do, which is that she went to the police, she reported the attack, she went to the hospital, and it turned out that there was sort of this spree. It started with her, but then there were 4 other people to whom something similar had happened. So I'm showing you part of this slide, and the first date, January the 3rd, 1984, is when Janet was attacked. And then there were these 4 other attacks, and they had very similar MOs, or modus operandi. And so the police were very fixated on finding this person, and in particular they were fixated because it was a black man who was attacking white women. And so this case had very high priority in Richmond. So what happened was that one of the people who had been attacked saw a man on the street one day. And the man that she saw was an 18-year-old named Thomas Hainsworth. And she said, she saw him, she called the police, and she said, I think that's the person who attacked me. And so Thomas Hainsworth, who had no criminal record, had been sent to the store, it was a Sunday, to buy sweet potatoes for dinner, was surrounded by police, and there was a show-up identification where they brought the victim to the scene, and there he was in handcuffs, surrounded by police, and they said, is that him? And she said, I think so, and that was enough to arrest him. So that was about a month after Janet was attacked. And then what's sort of interesting is that Thomas remained in jail. He never actually was out of jail again for another 26 years, but in the meantime, all of these attacks kept on happening. So long after he was incarcerated, more and more women were attacked in a similar way. But nonetheless, the police sort of didn't put the blue together with the red and were convinced that they had the right person. And so Thomas Hainsworth was tried in back-to-back trials, and he kept insisting that he was innocent. And he told me that really, it's outside of his family, no one believed him. And that in the jail, he was religious. They sent the chaplain in to speak with him. And when he told the chaplain and his wife about these charges and explained, but I'm innocent of all 5 of them, there was sort of this look of disbelief on the face of this man and his wife, and he said that they got up and left really quickly after that. And in fact, the jury also didn't believe that Thomas was innocent, and he was convicted, first in Janet's trial, and then he was convicted in 2 other trials. And at 19, he was sentenced to 74 years in prison. And then, after Thomas had been arrested and convicted, because it happened very fast, within about a period of 6 months, a man named Leon Davis Jr. was arrested. And that happened on December the 19th, so at the very end of the year. And that was the end of the crime spree. It just stopped. So here are the mugshots of Thomas Hainsworth and Leon Davis Jr. side by side. And I think it's interesting to think about these pictures and the way this whole thing went down. Leon Davis Jr. was never in any kind of photographic identifications that Janet or any of the other women were asked to look at. So when Janet was brought a sheet of pictures, there were 6 pictures, and Thomas's picture was in it, Leon Davis Jr.'s picture was not in it. They didn't have him in that lineup. They didn't think he was a suspect, and they didn't think that he was someone in the jail population that they wanted to include because he looked similar. He just wasn't there. And what studies show is that when you have a victim, particularly of a violent crime like this, who is in fear of their life, and you tell that person, which is what they told Janet, we have a suspect in custody, we would like to see if you can make an identification. Those words sound really innocuous, but what Janet heard was, we have this person, you just have to find him. And at that point, what happens is that your mind engages in something called relative judgment, which means your mind thinks it's a multiple choice test, and you need to get the right answer. So you're going to pick the person who looks the most like the right answer. And in this case, what Janet did is what almost any reasonable person would do under the circumstance, which is mistakenly but in good faith pick the person who looked the most like the person who had attacked her. And she picked the wrong person. And I talk about this in the book. It's called, I call it the perils of identification, but really it's the perils of cross-racial identification. And I'm sure you've all seen TV shows and movies where there's this very dramatic moment and the prosecutor says to the witness, do you see the person who did this in the courtroom? And they point and they say, that's him. And there's this dramatic moment. And there's really nothing like that. And as a defense attorney, I can tell you that once someone identifies your client and says they're 100% certain, it is very, very hard to undermine that certainty. And that juries listen to that and they see that identification and they think, okay, that's who it is. And witnesses sound credible because they truly believe that that's who it is, and that's what Janet believed. So this is kind of a different case than Cash's, where the eyewitnesses came in and they had their own agendas and they were getting their little side deals and they lied. She wasn't lying. She really believed that she had the right person, but she was wrong. And so another part of the problem is actually the sincerity of the identification, which the jurors also interpret as a reason to think that it's credible. And in this case, each woman was convinced that the perpetrator was Thomas Hainsworth. They all picked him. And then 8 months and 6 days after he had been arrested and convicted and judged a repeat violent sexual predator, they actually arrested this other man for another series of crimes that were incredibly similar. And this is just a picture of Thomas during his younger years in prison with his mom, his siblings, and his niece. A lot of people have a hard time, I think, wrapping their mind around this idea that we could convict people wrongfully, because it seems like our justice system is set up in a way that's supposed to make sure that that does not happen. And maybe you're thinking, oh, well, she's telling me this story about cross-racial mistaken identification, but that was from 1984, and surely we have moved on from that point. And it's sad for me to say this to you, but in fact, I don't believe that we have moved on at all. In the spring, I taught criminal procedure to a room full of students, not this big, but pretty big, and we went through the United States Supreme Court's case law on eyewitness identification, and they allow all of the things that I've been talking about, and they've allowed other things too. And it's depressing to me that in 2019, I'm teaching the same cases that are the cases that were guiding the prosecutors and the judges and the defense lawyers when Thomas Hainsworth was tried and convicted. And in fact, my students and I in the Racial Justice Clinic are representing somebody right now who was convicted in Louisiana in 2013 on a single cross-racial identification. So we believe that at least 2,200 people have been exonerated, but actually that number is higher because the slide is a little bit dated. There's an organization that keeps track of every single one starting in 1989. And every year it seems that it goes up. And I can tell you that last year, I just checked, there were 181 people who were exonerated. So we just sort of keep breaking the records year after year. And part of that is that we're getting better and better at uncovering some of these cases. So some people want to know, okay, well, how exactly do these things happen? And what we know is that with DNA identifications, misidentifications, and this is ultimately what happened in Thomas's case, and in many rape cases, especially from the 80s and the 90s, there wasn't DNA technology available, and then there was much, much later post-conviction. And they looked at the first 200 of those DNA exonerations, and I'm sure you've read about some of the more famous ones, and 154 of them involved mistaken identifications, of which 50% were cross-racial. So this is just a pattern that repeats itself again and again. And then we also know that of the first 1,600 exonerations, there were 55% that involved some kind of false testimony. So again, going back to my client's case, outright lies that people come in and tell at trial. And then 45% involved some kind of misconduct by police or prosecutors or both. And there is a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram with the false testimony because at times they're actually eliciting false testimony knowing it. I've been asked how many people in the United States have been wrongfully convicted. And that is a hard number because we don't know. The very, very conservative estimates are somewhere between 1 and 10%. So if you take that middle number, sort of around 5%, you get about 63,000 people, which is the capacity of Soldier Field, where the Chicago Bears play. I actually personally believe it's much higher, and I'll tell you why. I think that there are many, many wrongful convictions that happen at a lower level, at a misdemeanor level, more petty offense level. And the reason why I believe that is because we have some examples. And I think 2017 in a county called Harris County, which encompasses Houston and Texas, there were over 125 people who were exonerated of these low-level felonies because they were all pulled over on suspicion of carrying drugs or some other thing, and the police did this in-the-field test where they tested the substances they found in the field, and these tests were bogus, and these people were in jail, they couldn't make bail, and they wanted to get back to their families, they wanted their jobs back, their lives had been completely upended and disrupted, so they were offered a deal. They could plead guilty to a felony and get out, or they could stay in and fight their case and be in jail for months. And so many of them, over 125, they took the deal. And Harris County is one of the few counties that actually tests substances post-conviction. And so after the lab results came back, it found that a lot of this stuff, the so-called drugs, was things like flour and sugar and even Jolly Ranchers, which I don't even understand how you can think that a Jolly Rancher is a drug, but apparently they did. So we know just from this one county and this 1 year that we get 125 people. And that is simply because that county is different than other counties in that they test post-conviction. And you would think that if every county did that, we would find out that there are hundreds of people, thousands, probably tens of thousands, who are pleading guilty to these relatively low-level felonies to get out because they're desperate to get out because they're poor and they can't make bail, and so they plead guilty even though they're innocent. And I actually think that number is extraordinarily high. And the problem is that we lack the resources to uncover those, because if you're somebody like me and someone is coming to you and saying, I have this person, I really need to overturn their conviction, you say, okay, well, where are they? And you say, well, they're out when they pled to a felony 10 years ago. If you're me, you're thinking, well, I have this guy in Louisiana and he's doing 60 years of hard labor with no possibility of parole, so that guy is going to come first. There aren't a lot of innocence projects or innocence advocates or pro bono lawyers who have the time and the resources to look at the low-level cases, and that's why I think the number is actually much, much higher than we think. So getting back to this whole idea about wounds after conviction, and of course this is true in a quote-unquote rightful conviction case, but what struck me about the wrongful conviction cases, interviewing Janet and Thomas, because I spent a lot of time with both of them, was that they both experienced really similar emotions. For different reasons, but similar emotions. They both had post-traumatic stress. They both felt rage and shame. They both felt a sense of guilt. They felt very isolated. They both had suffered from a loss of a life plan. Thomas had wanted to, ironically, go to the police academy and become a police officer. Janet had wanted to go to college. She dropped out and was just not able to continue. Their lives took these really different turns, and they were sort of almost arrested in time by this event. And so what they were going through in parallel ways was kind of eerily similar when I was speaking to them. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so I'll tell you what happened to Thomas Hainsworth and to Janet. So in 2001, this is a long time after Thomas had been convicted, Virginia passed a law and it allowed people like Thomas to ask for DNA testing. And so Thomas petitioned and petitioned, and he finally got this young woman interested in helping him named Shawn Armbrust, who was running a very small innocence project based out of Washington, D.C. And so she pressed the people in Virginia, and they kept telling her, we don't keep all that stuff and we destroy it. But what was really interesting was that the criminologist in Thomas's case was a woman named Mary Jo Burton, and she was really unusual. She kept all of the evidence that she tested. She kept little snippets of it inside of her files. So when they pulled her files, even though the lab had destroyed everything, her files had the DNA from Janet's case. She had testified in Janet's case. And she had also testified in this other case, the case of Marvin Anderson, who had become Thomas Hainsworth's friend, because they were very close friends in prison. And so when the rape kit came back in Marvin's case, and he was only convicted in a single case, but again, it was a cross-racial identification, his conviction was overturned based on this evidence pointing to someone else, and he was pardoned. And at that point, there was a lot of concern and a feeling that, okay, maybe there are more people like Marvin Anderson out there, and that's when all of Mary Jo Burton's files were ordered retested. And that's when Thomas's case finally caught some traction. And Shawn Armbrust was able to convince the authorities to test the evidence in Janet's case. And they found out, needless to say, that the actual rapist was Leon Davis Jr. The way they delivered this news was that they tried to go to the house where Janet had lived when she had been raped, which was her parents' house. Of course, this is 26 years later, and her mom directs them to the house where she lived with her husband and her 2 kids. And they come in, and everybody's at home. It's a Sunday. And she thinks that they're coming to tell her that Thomas has another parole hearing, because every time he had a parole hearing, she would write a letter objecting to him ever getting released on parole. And instead, they just tell her this kind of earth-shattering news. And then they leave and they say, well, you know, I wouldn't worry about it too much because he wasn't such a great guy anyway. And that was basically the last that she ever heard from the police or the prosecutors in that case. And then Thomas found out the way most people who are in custody find out. He got a letter, and he really, understandably, couldn't believe it. And so he asked his cellmate, tell me if this says what I think it says. And he said, yeah, that's what it says. And the relief that Thomas felt that someone believed him finally was overwhelming. So this case, the breaking open of this case, raises all of the issues that I was talking about cross-racial identification and police practices and wanting to do the right thing and victims and concentric circles. But Thomas's case was more complicated because there were 2 other guilty verdicts against him, and Mary Jo Burton had not testified in those other cases. And so there was no DNA evidence. It had been destroyed. And the other 2 people who had been attacked were not taking back their identifications. And so Thomas's case posed this really unusual legal question, which is, if you believe that there was a serial rapist in 1984, and you now know he was responsible for 13 attacks, and there are 3 more for which someone else is doing a life sentence that seem the same, what do you have to show to get the wrongfully convicted person out from under the convictions that you believe this one person was single-handedly responsible for? So this is, I think, another example and an unusual example of restorative justice in litigation, which I rarely see. So I was telling you about my experience with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, which was very disillusioning. Thomas's experience with the police and the prosecutors and ultimately the Attorney General in Virginia was very different. So the woman with the red hair, that's his attorney, Sean Armbrust, and then the 2 men on the same row with her are the local DAs in the 2 different counties where he was convicted. And when she went to them with Janet's DNA evidence and this evidence that there was someone else who had done these other crimes and her belief that that person was responsible for the 2 remaining convictions, those 2 DAs dug into it and they started to come around to the idea that Thomas was innocent. And then they got Janet involved. She's at the bottom. Sean went to talk to her, and Janet was really like looking for answers at that point and wanting to understand what had happened and kind of make sense of the situation in a way that she hadn't been able to before. And so Sean talked to her a lot about wrongful convictions and mistaken identification, and also said, if you would be willing to come forward even anonymously, which of course you're allowed to be anonymous as a survivor of sexual assault, that would be really helpful to our case. And so Janet partnered with the man next to her, Frank Green, who was a longtime reporter at the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and he ran a series of stories about the case that got some attention. He quoted Janet. She agreed to be interviewed. And then the gentleman who is on everyone's the furthest on the right, it was the Attorney General at the time. His name is Thomas Cuccinelli II, and he may be familiar to you because he is now Trump's immigration czar. But at the time, he was the state's Attorney General, and he was considered a rising star in the Tea Party movement. And it seemed to these 2 local prosecutors that this might be the end of the road for Thomas Hainsworth, because it was really up to the Attorney General to go to the state's highest court and argue over whether or not this conviction should be upheld. So they went and sat down with Cuccinelli and talked to him about it, and he actually was very interested, and then he did his own investigation, and he became absolutely convinced that Thomas was innocent. And so this really unusual thing happened, which was that all these advocates came together, and they decided that they were going to be on the same side. So of course, we always have the state versus the defendant, so state versus Hainsworth, the Commonwealth of Virginia versus Thomas Hainsworth, and in this case, the Commonwealth moved over to the other side of the V to be on Thomas Hainsworth's side, which is a very, very unusual thing for the Attorney General to do, particularly this Attorney General. And even that wasn't enough. The Virginia Court of Appeal was extremely skeptical of this, and so they asked the Attorney General to prove to them that there was evidence that conclusively established that Leon Davis Jr. was the same man who had raped the 2 women in the cases where there was no DNA evidence. So that was the burden that the Attorney General had. And it's interesting to me that even with all of this agreement, the case had to be argued twice, first by a panel of 3 judges, and then all 9 of them wanted to hear it, or all 7 of them. I'm not doing my math right. And even then, it was a 1-paragraph decision, and they didn't really give any reasoning. They just ruled 4-3 that they were going to overturn these convictions, and they were going to let Thomas out. But it's not a precedent-setting case. What's interesting about it is it's very long, because of the 4 judges who dissented quite angrily and did not feel that they had brought enough evidence, and actually thought that the eyewitness identifications that had not been recanted were enough and that he should remain in prison. So even with all of this cooperation, and I think kind of looking at almost restorative justice and action in litigation, it was extremely difficult to prevail. But he was released on his 46th birthday, and that's a picture of Thomas and his mom outside of the prison. And he said, "I'm glad my mother is alive, that she can see this." So we think about that, I think, in a traditional way as kind of the end of the story, because we think, okay, well, now it's time for the happy ending. I think a lot of people are really invested in the idea of happy endings, and we think, okay, well, that's really the end of the movie. But of course, what you're left with is all of this trauma, because actually exonerations are extremely traumatic. And so when I was talking to Janet, she talked about suffocating with guilt and anxiety and wanting to feel free but feeling trapped. And Thomas also saying that he felt almost lonely in the joyfulness that he felt in his release, and that it was very hard for other people to understand what he had been through and very hard for him to readjust to the real world. So they're both kind of struggling in their own ways. And this just goes to, I think, this myth that we have that there's this happily ever after where you can ride off into the sunset and everything is great. And we love to believe that. And I think that's something that we really like to feel strongly about in the cases of wrongful conviction. But I think it actually makes more sense to think about exonerations as earthquakes because they're extremely disruptive. And in the wake of an exoneration, there's all of this upheaval and there is ruin. And there's the ruin of ideals, there's the ruin of a sense of security in the way that our government is supposed to operate, in the way that our justice system is supposed to operate, and even in the idea that there is such a thing as justice. So what I think of it as a psychological prison, because when the exoneration occurs and the person is set free, there's still this sense that people are trapped and incarcerated in these emotional, psychological, psychic prisons they're very difficult to get out of. And so it really led me to think, especially in the wake of Cash's exoneration, about the differences between the criminal justice system and the restorative justice system. You know, the criminal justice system asks three basic questions. It's focused on what law was broken, who broke it, and how we should punish that person. And in our society, what that often means is that we punish that person to the maximum extent possible because we believe in retribution and we believe in deterrence. And restorative justice is more interested in asking who was harmed with this holistic concentric circle idea of harm. What are the needs of the harmed people and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So it's a real radical reframing of crime and punishment, of harm and healing. People ask how it works. It works in a lot of different ways. A famous example is South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which some people might be familiar with after the end of apartheid. There was a commission that was set up to address some of the wounds and harms inflicted by apartheid, which were legion. There weren't prosecutions, there were testimonials by the victims, there was testimony by the perpetrators, and there was some effort at some kind of reparations. In the United States, what we often have are victim offender dialogues, and I know that there are some people here in this audience who have experienced them, who have been victims themselves, who have come face to face with people who have harmed their loved ones. There are also healing circles where it can be a bigger group of people. You can have the person who was harmed, the person who committed the harm, support groups, family members, therapists, other people who are experts in restorative justice facilitators. It's really considered in some ways an antidote to the school to prison pipeline. So it's becoming more popular in the US with children because we think of children as more capable of redemption and rehabilitation. But there are also some pilot programs that are offering restorative justice to adults. And there's one actually that I looked at in Boston called RISE, which stands for Repair, Invest, Succeed, and Emerge. So when I started looking at this, I found the people who I think in the wrongful conviction context really kind of brought this idea forward that restorative justice could apply in wrongful convictions. And that's Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton. They co-wrote this best-selling book, Picking Cotton, which some in the audience may have read or be familiar with. It's a similar story to Janet and Thomas's, although it was just a single case. And they came together after Ronald's DNA exoneration formed this bond. And what Jennifer says is that they were practicing restorative justice without even realizing it, that she had reached out to Ronald in the years after his release, and they had met in a church and had this incredibly emotional reunion and then formed a relationship. And what Jennifer ended up doing was starting an organization called Healing Justice to offer the same kind of service and programming that she and Ronald Cotton had done in this really ad hoc, informal way, that she wanted to systematize it and make it available to more people. And so I started observing some of the work of Healing Justice, and I went to one of their retreats. And while I was looking into this, Janet had also gotten in touch with Jennifer, and so she and Thomas were thinking about attending a retreat or trying to figure out how really to meet each other. And Janet was very interested in sitting down with Thomas, and so she went to Sean, Thomas's lawyer, and what Sean told me was, she said, you know, I think you need the right victim and the right exoneree at the right point in their lives. And so they decided they were giving this award to Jennifer Thompson for all of her advocacy, a Champion of Justice Award that actually Attorney General Eric Holder gave to her. And they decided that they were going to have Janet and Thomas co-present this award, even though they had never met each other. So they were going to meet in the weeks leading up to this event and then surprise Jennifer by co-presenting it. And Sean basically was in the role of the restorative justice facilitator. And Janet was extremely nervous leading up to this meeting, and I think so was Thomas, and it was a very emotional meeting. They met in a conference room, and Janet cried, became extremely emotional. And this is what Thomas told her. I think it's really beautiful. He said, I cannot forgive with my love. I can forgive with God's love. My love isn't perfect, but God's love is perfect. I can give that. And they had this really meaningful reconciliation. And then a couple of weeks later, they stood together and gave Jennifer Thompson her award. And Janet told publicly the story of what had happened to her for the first time. And I think for Jennifer, she kind of saw the work that she was doing coming full circle, and she realized that the project that she was taking on was much bigger than her own particular case and Ronald's case and their own particular relationship, and actually this was something that you could apply to so many other people to help them. So the concept of healing justice in these reunions is that you really, instead of avoiding what happened or trying to push it away or bury it, you go back to the crash site and you sort through the wreckage with the other person who was on the other side of the courtroom, the person who you thought could never understand, but in the end is the only person who can completely understand. And part of that is thinking about the crime and the trial and the conviction and the aftermath as a shared traumatic experience, as something that you have together and that you heal from together. And also thinking about it if this is something that is empowering to you as a means of reform. And there are many exonerees and crime victims who are forming coalitions to advocate for reforms to the system that would stop things like this from happening in the first place. But there are also situations where it doesn't always work. And we were talking at dinner a bit about how we think that maybe if we compensate people and we give them money, that will somehow ameliorate the situation and make their pain go away. And we can talk more in the question and answer session about this, but the US is very odd in the sense that whether you get any money after a wrongful conviction depends on the state that you live in. And some states, like my home state of Pennsylvania, give you no money. Other states make you prove certain things to get money. Some states give you very little. In this case, in North Carolina, which is the same state actually where Jennifer Thompson was attacked, a man named Daryl Hunt served 20 years on a wrongful conviction, and he actually got, I think, over $2 million when he was exonerated, which sounds like a lot of money. And he got married, and he traveled the world. He made a film that was shown at Sundance, and so you would think that he was living this wonderful life. And Jennifer had been in touch with Daryl Hunt because they served on a board together and they lived in the same area. And so when she started Healing Justice, she invited him to the first retreat that they had, and he never showed up. And no one could get in touch with him or figure out what was going on. And then on the last day of the retreat, they learned that he had killed himself, that he had shot himself in a parked car, alone. And so this is a picture of the ceremony that they had at this retreat, which was supposed to be about healing and reconciliation, and turned into a memorial of Daryl's life. And those are his, you can't see, but on the table are its initials, DH. And one of the things they talked about is how important it is to really have reconciliation and to do this work earlier on rather than later. Daryl was someone who had been exonerated in 2001, but 15 years later he had not healed from what had happened, I think in part because everyone assumed that he was doing so well, because he had all these markers of success. He had a settlement, he had a wife, he had a job, but he had never really dealt with the pain and the trauma of having been wrongfully incarcerated in his particular case too, which was extreme. And he had been self-medicating and become depressed. And so the idea really is to catch people before they get to this point. And it's not just exonerees. I think there are many victims to whom this happens as well. So that's a picture of the memorial, which I think is quite beautiful that they made. But there are also stories of triumph, and this is just a short story of this man named Jerome Morgan, who I met, who is an exoneree from Louisiana. So I'm hoping my current client follows Jerome Morgan's path. And I will say that Jerome Morgan is one of more than 20 black men who has been exonerated in Louisiana, all of whose trials lasted less than a day, including my client, but he hasn't been exonerated yet. But Jerome is someone who, when he got out, he took advantage of healing justice, and he went to retreats, and he really just did the hard work kind of at the outset. I showed various pictures of him. The picture of him in the baseball cap is actually 2 years before he was convicted of a murder that he didn't commit, so he was very young. And then the picture of him in the middle is him pitching his nonprofit for seed money, which he won. They won first prize, and they got some seed money to start a barbershop to teach young men a vocation, a skill, and to be part of the community and to give back. So there are happy stories that come out of healing justice, and these are just some of them, but these are people who've been wrongfully convicted, or family members, or exonerees and victims who have come to these retreats and connected with each other in a way that I think is really powerful. And then there are also stories of reform, and people, all of the people in these pictures, and I'm a little over on my time, so I don't want to get too far into it, but suffice it to say that they have been successfully advocating for changes in the law to prevent a lot of the injustices that led to their situations coming about. And then the year that I went to the retreat, they had this really beautiful ceremony on the last day. They brought this sapling from the Oklahoma City bombing, which folks may remember was in 1995. That was the bombing that resulted in the deaths of many, many people in a federal building in Oklahoma City, including the deaths of children who were in the nursery school there, the daycare center. And so Oklahoma has this tree that survived the bombing. It was in the parking lot, and the parking lot was pretty much decimated, but somehow the tree actually survived the fires that resulted from the bombing. And so they replanted it and made it part of this memorial that you're looking at. And they give saplings to certain applicants, and it's hard to get one and to take it out of state, but they were convinced to give a sapling to one of the healing justice participants so that she could take it from Oklahoma back to North Carolina for Daryl Hunt's ceremony, which they had for him a couple of years after his death. And this is what Jennifer Thompson said when we planted the sapling at the retreat. She said, "This tree is in memory of Daryl Hunt and all those we couldn't save and all of those that we won't save. But it is also in honor of all of us here and all of us who have survived. This tree will shelter us, provide shade, and endure, and we will watch it grow. We are still standing, and our roots are deep." And then I like to end with this picture. That's Cash and me last year. So we see each other fairly often, I would say, and I'm happy to report that he is doing very well. He also was fortunate, I suppose fortunate is the right word. He got a large amount of money from Los Angeles, both from the state and also after suing them, and he is living a nice, peaceful life. His mom is still alive, which I'm happy to say, and he's happily partnered with someone, and they're living, I think, a pretty good post-conviction existence. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. I went on a little long. I apologize for that. I'm curious to listen to any questions or answer any questions that folks have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great talk.
Oh, sorry.
Please come down and use these microphones that Jean is fixing up for you and ask some questions. Talk about restorative justice. How about a student or two?
I see someone.
Here comes somebody.
Good morning, and thank you. Good morning. Good evening.
Hi.
Thank you for such a wonderful talk. I'm just curious if you can give us any suggestions for specific actionable steps that we as community members in a small town in the middle of Minnesota might be able to do to move forward with the movement?
So I think there are a couple of things that are fairly easy to do. One of them is to donate to your local Innocence Project, because even like $25 or $50 can make a big difference. I should have said this at the beginning, but there's kind of the Mothership Innocence Project that was founded by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld in New York, and then there are these littler ones like the one in Los Angeles that I directed, and they are in part dependent on nonprofits. They are dependent on donations, and so even small donations I think really helps them staff up these cases and work the cases and even hire new people to help and reach more people. So I think that's just one small step. I also think another one is just sort of being conscious of how all of this stuff plays out and not taking for granted the stories that are, I think, the kind of convenient criminal justice stories that are often portrayed by the media, where there's sort of a bad guy and a perfect good guy and a perfect victim and a horrible monster, that it's so much more complicated often than we ever are really led to believe, and that it's not a black and white situation. And even if you can kind of reorient your perspective in kind of a more global way and think about things differently than you otherwise might have, I think that's an important step of all of us kind of reorienting our perspective. And then I also think another thing that's important is to really pay attention to what's on your local ballot and vote. I think voting for especially whoever your DA is hugely important. And there's all this attention right now on what's going on in the federal government with our US Attorney General, and rightly so. It is concerning. It's very concerning. And it's also important to remember that there are only 100,000 people who are prosecuted federally every year. Everyone else, 90% of the people who go through the system in state court. And that means that the people who are deciding their fate are DAs. And who elects the DAs? You do. And it's a big difference between having the kind of DA that I was up against and having the kind of DA who was more helpful in Thomas's case. And more now we're hearing about district attorneys running on these progressive platforms. And I think it's important to vote in those elections. People think, oh, well, it doesn't really matter, it's just local, but it matters tremendously. It matters more, I think, than what's happening almost, nationally, even though it doesn't seem like that's the case. And so I really urge people to get involved and read about these candidates and vote for people who you think are actually going to do justice, and not the person who was endorsed by some powerful person or who you voted for 10 times in the past.
Hi, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I am in Dr. Morgan's Peace and Justice class. I realized I was not talking into the microphone, sorry about that. But one thing we struggled with was, how do you apply restorative justice? Like, how do we get to that point? Like, our class, we talked about it, but it's just so hard to just change. So how, as Americans, do we do that?
So that's a really good question, because our system is obviously extremely adversarial, and so we default to the adversarial model. So part of it is educating people. A lot of people don't know what restorative justice is. I'm embarrassed to say that until 2015, I was one of those people. So I think there's a lot about this that involves raising awareness. But I also think it kind of starts with your own life and the stories that we tell ourselves about relationships in our own lives, not necessarily criminal, but that have impacted us and have broken apart. I've thought about this a lot in writing this book, where I had this narrative that I told myself about this fundamental, important relationship that went wrong, where I felt that I had been victimized and the other person was the perpetrator. I think we often think that in our lives when something goes wrong with people who have the ability to harm us. And you can even start applying it in your own life and think, well, there's another side to that narrative, and try to put yourself on the other side of that. Really, really put yourself there and think, have I been telling myself a story that, while real to me, isn't really the whole story? And that isn't there a way in which, on some level, I'm responsible too? And that you can see relationships in all of their complexities and understand that there are perpetrators and victims on both sides all in one relationship, which is more common than you would think. And I think it's just an important point for all of us to take with us, even if we have no contact with the criminal justice system.
Hi. So you talked about restorative justice circles and programs where the perpetrator and the victim sort of reconcile. Do you think that law enforcement and parts of the criminal justice system, like the defense and whoever was prosecuted, do you think they have a place in those circles? And how should that sort of integrate if you do?
I do think that they do, and I feel like that's kind of the next step, and I'm glad you asked that. I think that's the important next frontier. And that program that I mentioned briefly in Boston called RISE, they do have the prosecutors and the defense attorneys in the circle with the offender and the victim. Now, in those cases, it's different than what I've been talking about in the sense that the person who's going through the restorative justice program has entered a guilty plea, and they are pending sentencing, and completion of this program is something that the judge takes into account at the sentencing, and they're selected through this process. They think this person could benefit from RJ. But they also think that the probation officer and the judge and the public defender and the prosecutor could benefit from it too. And so they all participate. And when you talk to the judge who set it up and the other judges who participate and the assistant United States attorney and the federal public defender and the probation officers, they all describe the experience as transformative. And so it is important to make them part of it and to make it real to them, because I think for people who are in the system, it seems like it's hard to talk about it without it seeming very kumbaya, kind of hippy-dippy. And so for them to actually be there and be invested and have skin in the game and participate makes an enormous difference when you're trying to convince them that it really works, that they should scale it up, and that they should talk to other jurisdictions about adopting it.
Thank you.
Hi. So I was thinking about this paper that I wrote a couple years ago that was called The Moral Justification for Monetary Compensation. And in my case, I was writing about colonization issues and countries that have been totally destroyed by things and have had zero forms of reconciliation. And when we're talking more about humans and one-on-one, I'm wondering, does monetary compensation allow perpetrators to get off more easily because they're able to pay for their sins literally rather than having to go through some sort of transformative process?
So I don't think that money by itself can ever really be a satisfying solution for the reason that you said. I think what a lot of victims want, and we're moving into more traditional situations where you have someone who was harmed, someone who committed the harm, and we know who those people are. And when you talk to victims in that context who are interested in restorative justice as an option, they may very well want to be compensated for various things: emotional distress, property destruction, therapy. There's a laundry list. But the money itself is often and usually not enough. And I think what most victims want is acknowledgement and recognition by the person who harmed them or harmed their loved one, that they are reckoning with what they've done and they're going to take responsibility for it. So if you just sort of hand someone money and think you're going to make them whole and you can walk away, that is probably a mistaken belief. And I think in the Daryl Hunt exoneration case, you see how just kind of handing someone some money and convincing yourself it's going to be okay generally means that it's probably not. So I think at the core of restorative justice is really that personal connection and the acknowledgement and the reckoning with the harm that was caused. And that's not something that you can pay for.
Thank you.
More questions?
I have a comment. Do I have to use the microphone? I think it's critically important for all of you to know that in this community, I think it's critically important for all of you to know that in this community, in the prison in Duluth here, you have a restorative justice program going on right now. In the Moose Lake prison, just down the road here, you have a restorative justice program going on right now. And in Carleton County, you also have a restorative justice program going on. So it is happening right here in this county and also in Carleton County. And for those of you that want some information about that or want to get involved in restorative justice in St. Louis County or Carleton County, it exists strongly. And we have a pre-charge diversion program for youth in Carleton County. We have a program called Inside Out, where offenders go out into the community and talk to the public about the school to prison pipeline. So it exists here. I'm really proud that we have a strong RJ program in our area here, and lots and lots of different advocates for that. So I just wanted to share that because I think it's critically important for this community to know.
Thank you, and I'm glad to hear it, and I'm not surprised because Duluth is so progressive. And I do think it's also just important to briefly say that there is a lot of restorative justice going on inside of prisons that does some amazing rehabilitative work.
Two questions. First one is about going forward and things that could change now. There's one that seems pretty straightforward. It just requires a commitment, and that's actually testing every rape kit and testing every drug test. And there's nothing but money and commitment in the way to make that happen. And even doing it in 90 days. Like, we're not talking 5 years. This is not that difficult. So that's number one, and I just don't understand why that hasn't happened yet. Number two is, what can we do about eyewitness testimony? This is something that there's 50 years of history that shows it's horrible. Racial disparities are off the chart, abysmal. And how do we, in our US justice system, if we look at what we're looking at, change the emphasis that is put on eyewitness identification, which is just proven to be horrible?
So I'm going to take the second question first. And I'm sad to say that I've pretty much given up on the United States Supreme Court with respect to eyewitness identification. But I do think that there are some states that have taken really good steps and have great laws in place. And actually, particularly in North Carolina, due to Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton's advocacy, they now have eyewitness identification laws that are really strict, and in particular allow for expert testimony so that juries can understand that when you hear, I'm 100% certain, that's not necessarily the case, and that juries are educated about the way that lineups are conducted, show-ups are conducted in ways that can suggest the answer, put pressure on the witness, even if it doesn't seem like that's what happened, even to the person themselves. So there are some states that are role models in this area, and I don't know why it is, because you're right, we have known since the 1970s that this is a problem, and it really is difficult for me to understand why my client is doing 60 years with no possibility of parole based on the worst possible identification procedure you could imagine, which is the one that Thomas Hainsworth was subjected to, where there's literally no one to compare the person to. It's cross-racial, they're in handcuffs, there's police officers on either side, and they say, do you think it's the person? And that's the whole case. And it's stunning to me that that is still happening. And it's shameful, and I think that the only way to combat it is to pass these state laws, which is something that I'm working on in California, because I'm embarrassed to say that California doesn't have a particularly good law, although at least it's not as bad as some states that disallow eyewitness identification experts to testify at all. So it's not a very satisfying answer. I think it's an incremental process where you have to go state by state and educate legislators, often by bringing forward exonerees and victims who are saying this is what happened, don't let this happen to anybody else, to convince them to carry these bills forward and to pass them. So I think that's where we are with eyewitness identification. And then with respect to how else we can go about kind of repairing the system, I definitely feel that there's this sense that we're kind of stuck a little bit. It seems like on the federal level we're seeing a lot of things going backwards, but I'm heartened by the comment before your question, which was about what was happening in your community. And I think at this point, for those of us who are disheartened by what is happening nationally and maybe seeing things in some respects go backwards, we can look internally to our own communities and see movement forward. And it's important to be attentive to that and grow that and be aware of that and support it in any way that we can, whether it's here or in some other state, because I really feel at this point that that's the only way that change is going to happen.
In regards to our current prison systems, there seems to be the trend towards privatization. And do you have any real comments on how it affects everything you've talked about tonight?
So I think privatization of prisons makes a bad situation even more hellish and horrible, because the problem with a for-profit prison industry is that they're trying to make a profit. So instead of spending $5 on someone who's incarcerated, they'll spend $1. And so all of the things that we hear about prisons, how violent they are and how horrible the quality of care, medical care, food, health, etc., all of those things are just exacerbated when you're talking about a private entity that's trying to make a profit off of people who are incarcerated. And at the same time, the private prison industry was sort of slowly going by the wayside, but now with the recent administration, it's kind of come back in a more visceral, prominent way, which I think is highly unfortunate. So I think I'm very against private prisons, I guess, is the short answer to your question. I think they're bad, very bad.
Good evening.
Hi.
My name is Stan Hendrickson. I've lived here in Duluth all my life. I own 360 acres of property at the end of the McQuaid Road. Can they hear me all right? I can talk generally pretty loud. And I had a judgment against me for $330,000. Okay, they took the property and sold the property, which they could do. And then another brother redeemed the property, and therefore nobody appealed it to the Minnesota Appellate Court or the Supreme Court, and the court would not honor it. And therefore, when he redeemed, that makes it clear of any debts that were paid, whether it was $1 million or $500,000 or whatever, but it was redeemed for $23,000. The 5 attorneys went back in and said he couldn't own the property that way. That was not the way it was done. But after that was done, the state redeemer of properties went in and vacated 550.225, which states that anyone can come in and buy the property, and once it's purchased and it's not appealed, it is a clear title to the owner. I've been fighting that now for the last 25 years. I appealed it to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court said that it was filed late, couldn't possibly be late when it was mailed on a Monday, and the following Sunday it was time to file. That was the deadline. But they claim they never got it until. Pardon? Is there a question? I have a question. Well, the question is, how do we go about people honoring Minnesota statutes? They violated at least 25 of them in my case, time and time again. I present them to the court just ignores them. So what do we do?
Well, I don't practice in Minnesota, so I can't advise you about what Minnesota statutes say or don't say. What I can say is that you're pointing to a problem that a lot of people have, which is they're often told by courts that the court doesn't want to hear their case on the merits, which means, the basis of the case, the claim, the actual claim of injury. And instead what they're saying is, you filed too late, or you filed at the wrong place, or you filed at the wrong time, or you said the wrong thing in the wrong way. And those are procedural defaults and technical limitations that have two purposes. One is to streamline litigation, but the other one is to keep people out of court. And it sounds to me as if that is what has been happening to you, but that's just my guess based on what you told me, is that those are technicalities that are designed for that purpose.
Well, we have to get these things straightened out, because it's like these murder cases and other things. County attorneys have just violated the laws of the statutes, people's rights. Other people have come in and testified and lied to the court, and one of the gentlemen later was found that his DNA was not there in Oklahoma, and neither was his partner, which they both spent 15 years in jail. They finally released them, but one of the gentlemen, after about a year, he committed suicide because he couldn't walk up and down the streets without probably thinking that they were still thinking, hey, he still did it.
Yes.
Regardless, it doesn't go around.
Yes, you're right. It's wrong.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you know anything about the Indian Child Welfare Act?
I'm sorry,
Do you know anything about the Indian Child Welfare Act?
no.
Oh.
Do you?
Well, are you a federal attorney?
I was a federal public defender from 2001 to 2008, but we never had any Indian Child Welfare Act cases in Los Angeles.
Oh. What if a social worker is like makes false statements, and so hold on. Like lies and is a corrupt social worker.
You mean lies to get somebody else wrongfully convicted?
Yeah, like their children taken.
Like the cases where they claim that there's been child abuse, but there's no child abuse? Something like that?
In cases where they didn't follow the ICWA law?
So, I mean, social workers aren't, I don't think, held to any different standard than a doctor or a civilian or any witness who comes in and lies. So a lie is a lie, no matter who tells it. And if you can show that the person, whoever they were, a nurse, a teacher, a doctor, a layperson came in and lied under oath, and that lie led to someone else's conviction, then that's a basis for overturning it. You don't have to be any particular person to have that be true. That's true. Perjury is perjury.
And after children are adopted by like the state, you know, is it possible to overturn the adoption?
I think it probably depends on the state. I mean, are you asking me, so a social worker comes in and says it's some kind of an unsafe environment, and based on that testimony, the court removes the child, and then later the parent-child relationship is terminated and the child is adopted
Yes.
elsewhere? I think it's probably a state-by-state situation. I don't think in California you could undo that adoption. I think once you have a final adoption in California that a judge has signed off on and the paperwork has been filed and the rights have been legally terminated, I don't believe there's a way to undo that.
Do you believe?
But that said, I'm not a family law attorney.
Okay.
I'd be interested in your opinion on the death penalty. We still have that in 29 states. And from what I understand, there's like 4,500 people on death row.
So I feel about the death penalty the way I feel about private prisons, which is I do not think that the death penalty is appropriate. That's putting it mildly. One of the states that has a death penalty is California. We have 728 people on death row in California, and the national statistics show that at least 4% of them are innocent. It's pretty outrageous. What's also very, very troubling is that there are many states that are executing people at quite a fast clip, including Texas, Oklahoma, Tennessee. There are states that really make very quick work of it, and there are certain cases, certain famous notorious cases, where it's pretty clear that they executed the wrong person. So even if you are someone who believes in retribution, which I don't, as some kind of healing mechanism for victims, this is a system that fails and also is undeniably racist. And in California, our new governor in 2019 declared a moratorium on the death penalty, meaning that he wasn't going to execute anybody as long as he was the governor. And many of the local DAs across California are continuing to get capital verdicts and put people on death row because their thinking is they'll just wait them out and then they can start up the execution chamber all over again. The DA in Los Angeles has gotten 22 death penalty verdicts in the 4 years that she's been in office. And they are all against Black and Latino men, every single one of them. I wish someone in this audience lived in Los Angeles County and could vote, because there is a DA election in Los Angeles in March, and she's being challenged, and in part she's being challenged on that record. So the short answer is I really think that the death penalty is truly horrible. I don't think it's effective. I don't think it's a deterrent. I think it's racist. It's expensive, and it doesn't bring, I don't think, any real solace to anyone.
Thank you for your very eloquent discourse this evening. I'm a recent new person here to the state of Minnesota from Georgia. And one of the concerns I have is, in your presentation, you very well stated that a large number of exonerations were scientifically based on DNA. And in my former home state, I'm not sure about the state of Minnesota, there's such a large backlog on DNA with respect to rape kits as well as other violent crimes that, you know, could exonerate someone based on DNA. You've spoken about donations for, you know, restorative justice and so forth. is there any way we can, as private citizens, help defray some of the costs? Because that's one of the biggest arguments states have for processing DNA kits.
You're
that
right.
We can help get this, because I think more people would be exonerated if we can get the scientific portion of the, justice system in sync.
You're right, and actually this goes to the first part of that question from the gentleman that I forgot to answer, which is about the rape kit backlog, which is horrific. And it's not just horrific because the DNA could exonerate people, it's horrific because, as was brought up earlier, these kits are not being tested in the first instance, and so what victims are often being told is, well, we're not going to move your case forward because we don't have the evidence, we don't have the evidence, we don't have the evidence. And they do scream and cry about poverty and how impoverished they are and they can't possibly test it. And usually that's not really true. And sometimes, in San Francisco, for example, they have to be shamed into doing their actual job. So we had an infamous rape kit backlog, and it was really because of the advocacy of several sexual assault survivors who brought it to the attention of the police commission and got the media's attention that there was this glare cast on the police and this crime lab, and they found that they had just been stockpiling these rape kits. And it really wasn't about the money, and it often isn't. It's really about just, I don't know, bureaucracy, things getting bogged down, and not prioritizing and caring about that kind of a case to the detriment of the people who are harmed, to the detriment of the people who, like Thomas Hainsworth are locked up. And this kind of goes back to this original point, but while the prosecuting attorney isn't directly responsible because they can only bring the cases that they're given, they work hand in hand with the police department. And they can bring a lot of pressure on the police and say, I ran on a platform of testing every rape kit, which is what our new DA ran on. Well, that creates an incentive for the DA to go to the police and say, I ran on this, you need to partner with me to make this a reality. You need to go in there and test these rape kits. You have the money, you need to go do it. And if it's a question of funding, then again, you can bring political pressure on the city council, on the mayor. I mean, I think there are things that we can do as citizens locally. We feel so disempowered because everything that's happening nationally seems vastly out of control. But locally we do have control. And locally, we can make a difference. I know we're all busy with all of the things that we're doing, but even just as I was saying, paying attention in voting, or going to a protest, or following local events as assiduously as we follow everything else that's happening can really make a big difference. A lot of what goes on are these excuses, money, time, that are, quite frankly, fake. And that when you call them out and force people to do their jobs, they do them.
This will be our last question, all right?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This should be a quick one, and it's a little lighter. So I'm just wondering if you could give us an easy definition of assault, and I want to give you a scenario.
Oh my God, it's like a law school exam. Okay.
Okay. Oh, all right. So say there's two brothers, and they get along for the most part. Totally different personalities. Joe and Kelly, let's say their names. Joe and Kelly. Joe, lively guy, likes to tell tall tales. Kelly's a little more serious. Well, they're at say a bar, and Joe starts talking smack about his brother Kelly. Kelly doesn't like it that particular day. He's not in such a good mood, grabs Joe by the collar, glares at him, and then releases him with a shove. Joe charges Kelly with assault. Do you think that Kelly will face a conviction?
That's an assault and a battery. I mean, all it takes to assault someone is just to have them be in reasonable fear that they're going to make an unwanted contact with you. Assault is actually a pretty low standard. A battery is a contact, so you've described both things. You've described one person being placed in fear of being touched in a way they didn't want, and then the actual unlawful touching. So to answer my own or your law school exam, yes, it's an assault, and yes, it is a battery.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And we'll be out in the lobby. There can be more conversation, and maybe you'll sell a few books. Thank you all for coming. The next one is March 3rd. We're going to talk about justice and the environment.